Welcome to today's deep dive. Imagine you're looking at a country where over just a few decades, the infant mortality rate is just completely slashed in half.
Yeah, and at the exact same time, you've got nearly 100% of kids suddenly enrolled in primary school.
Right. And the average life expectancy jumps by a full 15 years. I mean, if you just look at those numbers on paper, it sounds like this unprecedented economic miracle.
Oh, absolutely. You would look at that and think this nation is on the verge of becoming a global powerhouse.
Exactly. But, and this is the wild part, what if I told you that in that exact same country, the broader economy is actually in a state of chronic collapse?
Right, like the carbon emissions are plummeting, but not because of some green energy revolution.
No, it's because the heavy industries and the factories have just been completely abandoned. And that massive generation of healthy, educated youth we just mentioned, they have absolutely zero statistical chance of ever securing a formal tax-paying job.
It's an incredibly frustrating paradox. I mean, you have this intense tension between miraculous human survival on one hand and total systemic paralysis on the other.
And exploring that exact tension is our mission for this deep dive. We're taking a really forensic look at a massive, frankly, kind of intimidating data set from the World Bank.
Yeah, it covers the macro evolution of what global institutions classify as fragile and conflict-affected situations, or FCS. And it spans from 1960 all the way to 2024.
And for you listening, we should probably define that term right off the bat. Fragile and conflict-affected situations is a very deliberate clinical term.
It is. We're talking about regions grappling with extreme levels of institutional fragility, social fracturing, or, active violent conflict.
Right, places where the fundamental social contract between the state and the citizen has basically disintegrated.
Exactly. The basic agreement that the government will provide security and services in exchange for taxes and lawfulness, it's just deeply compromised.
And the way this data was handed to us is honestly fascinating. Like, we aren't just looking at a sprawling Excel spreadsheet here.
No, we've been given this highly specific set of visual design guidelines. It's for a presentation deck titled FCS Development Trajectory Data Panorama.
Yeah, Challenges and Leaps, I think is the subtitle. And the visual constraints placed on this data, they tell a story before you even read a single number.
They really do. I mean, the aesthetic directives are strictly minimalist. Every single chart has to sit on a pure white background.
Literally hex code FFFFFF, pure white. And the designers were strictly forbidden from using any bright, highly saturated colors.
Right. The palette is entirely dark gray and navy blue. They only allow one low saturation accent color, like a muted Morandi blue or this dark, dry blood red.
And they only use that red to highlight key turning points. Plus, there's an absolute ban on 3D graphics, drop shadows, or gradients.
Yeah, no visual tricks allowed. It is purely flat, high information density, two-dimensional charting.
It's like, well, it feels like the World Bank is acknowledging that the reality of these fragile nations is simply too stark to be dressed up with PowerPoint tricks.
Exactly. You can't hide a stagnant economic trend line behind a flashy 3D pie chart.
Right. When there's a major turning point, there's just a simple thin line arrow pointing up or down, or maybe a delicate circle drawn around a data cluster.
The data is basically forced to speak for itself. It creates this kind of intellectual honesty that I really appreciate.
Me too. It strips away the noise and forces you to confront the actual mechanics of what is happening on the ground.
And if we look at the executive summary slide 2 of this deck, it maps out this 4-quadrant matrix: population, economy, education, and health.
And the overarching narrative that emerges from this matrix is profound.
It really is.
Yeah.
We see these historic breakthroughs in human health and primary education occurring at the exact same time as these intractable bottlenecks in economic fragility.
Massive informal employment, completely stagnant institutional governance. It's all happening at once.
So let's start untangling this paradox. Because to understand any economy, you first have to understand the people inside it.
Right. Where they live, how old they are. And the data on human geography here is staggering.
Oh, it's a demographic tsunami. If you look at the third slide, we have this smooth, dark, navy trend line tracking urbanization in these fragile regions.
And it shows the urban population climbing from 21.9% of the total population, steadily up to 46.1%.
We really need to pause and process the magnitude of that shift. Going from roughly 1 in 5 people living in cities to almost half the population, that is a spatial revolution.
It's huge. You are effectively taking the entire rural populations of several mid-sized nations and just transplanting them into city centers.
Right, in the blink of a historical eye.
Now, in a stable, developing economy, we usually think of urbanization as a good thing.
Sure, that's the standard modernization theory.
Like, factories open in the cities, agricultural technology improves so you need fewer farmers, and people naturally migrate to the city for higher-paying formal jobs.
Exactly. The city acts as a magnet of opportunity. It's a pull factor.
But the mechanics of urbanization in these fragile, conflict-affected situations operate on an entirely different set of physics.
Completely different. This urbanization is almost exclusively driven by push factors, not pull factors.
Right, people aren't moving to the city to get a job at a newly opened manufacturing plant.
No, they are fleeing rural violence or localized warlordism, or severe climate shocks that have completely collapsed the rural agricultural supply chain.
So the city essentially becomes a fortress of last resort. It's not an engine of economic mobility at all.
That is a crucial distinction. And think about the mechanical pressure that places on a municipality.
I can't even imagine. When an FCS city doubles in size due to conflict migration, the local government isn't simultaneously laying down double the water pipes.
Exactly. They aren't building double the electrical grid or opening double the schools. The municipality itself is often politically weak or
Yeah.
highly corrupt.
Or completely bankrupt. So this steep blue line indicating 46.1% urbanization, we aren't talking about people moving into high-rise apartments downtown.
Not at all. We are talking about the explosive, completely unregulated growth of informal settlements and slums.
Millions of people living on the extreme margins of the urban landscape, demanding basic services that the state just cannot provide.
You have massive density without the corresponding infrastructure. And that density becomes an absolute pressure cooker when you look at the age of the people arriving.
Which brings us to slide 4, and a pretty terrifying demographic data point. The visual here is a harsh, dark red box drawn around this very specific, dangerous plateau.
Yes, the youth dependency ratio.
For anyone listening who doesn't look at population pyramids every day, the youth dependency ratio is the number of children aged 0 to 14, expressed as a percentage of the working age population.
And in these FCS regions, that number is oscillating in this high vibration plateau between 69.4% and 73%.
To translate that percentage into human reality, a ratio of 70% means that for every 10 working-age adults, there are 7 children under the age of 15.
7 children that need to be fed, clothed, housed, educated, and medicated. It's a staggering burden.
Just to give a point of comparison, if you look at a highly developed, stable economy, that ratio might be closer to 20 or 25%.
Right, exactly. In those stable economies, the base of working-age people is wide enough to easily support the youth.
But in a fragile state, the base of dependence is incredibly wide. Every single adult in the workforce is carrying a crushing demographic burden.
Now let's look at the macroeconomic mechanics of that burden. If an adult is spending 100% of their meager daily income just to provide basic calories and shelter for a bunch of kids, what happens to their savings?
Well, they don't have any. Every penny is consumed by immediate survival.
Right. And if the citizens have 0 savings, the domestic banks have no deposits.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about the banking angle.
It's critical. If the banks have no deposits, they cannot lend money to local entrepreneurs to start businesses. It completely chokes off domestic capital accumulation.
So the resources of the family, and by extension the resources of the state, are entirely consumed by basic provisioning for the young. There is literally nothing left over for investment in the future.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I know you often like to play devil's advocate with this stuff.
I do, yeah. I want to push back on the negativity of this framing a bit, because when you read macroeconomic forecasts about developing nations, you constantly hear about the demographic dividend.
Yes. The idea that having a massive cohort of young people is the ultimate secret weapon.
Right. Like, in 10 or 15 years, shouldn't this massive youth population translate into a booming, energetic workforce? Why is a young population viewed as a red flag here, rather than a red carpet to future growth?
That is the defining structural question for these regions. Yes, in theory, youth is a demographic dividend. But a large youth cohort only becomes a dividend if they transition into a labor market that actually has formal, productive jobs waiting to absorb them.
So the dividend is highly conditional.
Extremely conditional. If these youths enter the workforce and the economy cannot absorb them, that demographic dividend instantly metastasizes into a demographic nightmare.
Because you have a massive, highly energized, urbanized population with absolutely no economic outlet.
Historically, this specific demographic profile, a huge youth bulge with high unemployment concentrated in urban centers, is the primary driver of social unrest.
It's the fuel for political instability and renewed armed conflict. It's what keeps the nation trapped in the FCS category to begin with.
Precisely. So this massive influx of youth into the cities naturally forces us to ask, what kind of economy are they actually stepping into? Can it support them?
And the data on macroeconomic growth provides a very grim answer on slide 5. We're looking at a jagged, highly volatile trendline tracking GDP per capita.
And it's crucial to note that this is calculated in constant 2015 US dollars.
Right, let's break that down for you listening. Why is the decision to present this data in constant 2015 dollars so vital for understanding fragile states?
Because in a fragile state, hyperinflation is incredibly common. We have to strip away the illusion of inflation.
How does that illusion work mechanically?
Well, imagine a government that cannot collect taxes because the economy is broken, but they still need to pay their military to fight off a rebellion. What do?
They just fire up the printing press. They print more money.
Exactly. So if you look at nominal GDP, just the raw numbers, it might look like the economy is growing by 50% a year.
But in reality, the currency is collapsing and a loaf of bread suddenly costs $1 million.
Right. By pegging the data to constant 2015 prices, the World Bank strips away that inflation mirage. We see the actual real purchasing power of the citizens over time.
And when you strip away that mirage, the reality is painfully slow. Over the decades covered by this X-ray, the real GDP per capita has only crawled from $1,113 to $1,419.
We are talking about adding barely $300 of value per person over an entire lifetime.
It's heartbreaking. But what really stands out visually aren't just the low numbers, it's the sheer violence of the trend line. The designers have placed these thin red circles around specific, deep plunges in the graph.
Those red circles represent periods of severe negative growth. This is the hallmark of an economy with absolutely no institutional shock absorbers.
It's like driving a car with no suspension over a pothole. Every bump shatters the chassis.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. In a robust economy, if a recession hits, you have mechanisms to soften the blow.
Like the central bank lowering interest rates to spur borrowing, or the government sending out stimulus checks.
Exactly. The social safety net provides unemployment benefits, so consumer spending doesn't just drop to zero. But in fragile and conflict-affected situations, those shock absorbers simply do not exist.
So a shock isn't just a bad quarter, it's a catastrophic contraction.
A single localized conflict, a military coup, a severe drought, or even just a sudden drop in the global price of whatever their primary export is, it can wipe out 10 years of slow, hard-won economic progress practically overnight.
The economy is basically trying to build a house of cards inside a wind tunnel.
Such a good analogy. And so how do the actual citizens survive in this wind tunnel? If the macroeconomy is constantly collapsing, what are people actually doing all day to feed themselves?
The data on slide 6 attempts to answer this by showing us an economic transition. We have a visual showing two distinct employment curves.
And the space between them, what economists call a scissors gap, is slowly narrowing.
Yeah, agricultural employment is dropping from 53.4% down to 46.5%, while employment in the services sector is expanding from 32.9% up to 40.3%.
Now, if you were looking at this exact chart shape in a stable developing nation, you would celebrate. Agriculture going down and services going up is the traditional textbook hallmark of economic modernization.
Because my mind immediately goes to the Western definition of services. I hear that word and I think of people leaving a subsistence farm to go work in an air-conditioned bank, or doing IT support, or managing logistics.
Right, it sounds like a sophisticated leap forward. And this is exactly where the sterile terminology of international data can really mask the human reality on the ground.
How so?
In an FCS region, this shift into the services sector does not represent a shift to a corporate desk. You have to connect this back to our urbanization data.
The people fleeing rural violence and moving to the slums.
Yes. Millions of people are arriving in dense urban slums. They obviously cannot farm in a concrete slum. But there are no factories to hire them, and certainly no corporate offices.
So the services sector just becomes a catch-all term for urban survivalism?
Exactly. It acts as a massive informal reservoir, a holding pen for desperate laborers. What does the services sector look like here? It looks like a young man selling single loose cigarettes to drivers stuck in traffic.
Or a woman running an unregulated, informal food stall on the sidewalk.
Right. It's washing windshields, domestic day labor, carrying bags at the bus station. This expansion of the services sector isn't a sign of high-end economic sophistication. It is a symptom of an economy desperately trying to absorb people who have no formal outlet.
That reframing is incredibly bleak. It turns what looks like a ladder of progress into just a lateral move from rural poverty to urban desperation.
And the subsequent data completely confirms this reality. Slide 7 tracks employment quality.
Yeah, there is a bold dashed warning line drawn straight horizontally across the graph right at the 66% mark. This is tracking what they call vulnerable employment.
And it is stubbornly, terrifyingly trapped between 66.3% and 70.5%.
That's over two-thirds of the entire workforce. What exactly constitutes vulnerable employment in the eyes of the World Bank?
It is defined largely as unpaid family workers and own account workers, essentially the self-employed informal street vendors we just described.
So to be in vulnerable employment means you operate entirely outside the legal and protective framework of the state.
Exactly. You have zero social safety net, no pension, no health insurance through an employer, no paid sick leave, no legal protection against workplace abuse, and absolutely no guaranteed minimum wage.
So if you get sick on a Tuesday, your family simply does not eat on Wednesday.
That's the brutal reality. And let's look at the macroeconomic poison of this dynamic. If over 66% of your national workforce is operating informally, paying for goods in untraceable cash, what is happening to the government's tax revenue?
It's virtually non-existent, right? I mean, you can't collect income tax from a guy selling loose cigarettes on the highway.
Precisely. And without tax revenue, the state remains politically fragile. It cannot afford to build paved roads. It cannot afford to pay its judges a living wage, which inevitably leads to corruption. And it cannot afford to build the formal infrastructure required to attract foreign investment.
It is a tragic closed-loop system. The state is too fragile to create a formal economy, and the massive informal economy doesn't generate the tax base needed to strengthen the state.
Furthermore, this massive informal sector is hypersensitive to those macroeconomic shocks we discussed earlier. These vulnerable workers live hand-to-mouth. They have zero financial cushion.
So when a crisis hits, say, a sudden spike in fuel prices, their purchasing power collapses instantly to zero.
And that immediately drags the rest of the domestic economy down with them. There is no resilience anywhere in the system.
Okay, we need to take a collective breath here because the mechanics of that economic trap are just really heavy.
They are. But as we move into the infrastructure and environment data, the visual narrative seems to shift dramatically towards something positive.
Yeah, the theme here on slides 8 and 9 is basically powering up while emitting less. We have a visual known as a step chart, which looks like a staircase.
And it shows a massive, undeniable leap in basic electricity access across these fragile regions, rocketing from 40.4% to 58.9%.
A jump of almost 20 percentage points in basic infrastructure access across the world's most difficult, chaotic environments. We really cannot understate what a monumental logistical achievement this is.
We really can't. Let's visualize the actual human impact of that step chart. For a family living in a fragile region, moving from darkness onto the electrical grid fundamentally alters the fabric of time.
It really does. It means children can study and read after the sun goes down.
It means a mother doesn't have to spend 3 hours a day foraging for firewood, only to burn highly toxic biomass inside her home just to boil water, which destroys her lungs over time.
And it means a micro-entrepreneur can reliably charge a mobile phone, allowing them to participate in mobile banking and digital transactions. Access to electricity is the foundational floorboard for modern survival.
And think about the mechanics of delivering that power. Building an electrical grid is hard enough in a stable country. In a conflict-affected situation, you are trying to lay miles of valuable copper wire in areas where it might be stolen by armed groups the next night.
You're building substations in rural areas with no paved roads.
You're trying to manage utility billing systems in areas with a weak rule of law, where people might just illegally tap the lines. The fact that local governments, working with international aid, managed to get this number close to 60% is a testament to sheer resilience.
But the companion data to this electrical boom creates a profound mystery. Slide 9 is a dual-axis chart. One line tracks that slow, crawling GDP. The other line tracks per capita CO2 emissions.
And right in the middle of the chart, the two lines cross and diverge violently.
Yeah, while the economy slowly inches upward, the per capita CO2 emissions drop like a stone. They plummet from 2.23 tons down to just 0.81 tons.
A nearly two-thirds reduction in the per capita carbon footprint.
Now, my natural inclination living in the 21st century and constantly hearing about climate change is to stand up and applaud. A massive drop in carbon emissions while expanding electricity
It
access.
sounds like a hidden environmental miracle.
Exactly. Are these fragile nations somehow leapfrogging dirty coal and moving straight to decentralized solar microgrids? Is this a massive green tech victory that the rest of the world should be studying?
I hate to shatter that optimism, but we have to read the environmental data through the unforgiving lens of economic fragility. This is almost certainly not a green tech victory.
Ah, okay. Break that down for me.
We have to ask,
Hmm.
what actually drives high per capita CO2 emissions in a developing nation?
Usually it's heavy industrialization, right?
Yes, it's the establishment of steel mills, massive cement factories, large-scale chemical manufacturing, and heavy freight transport running on diesel. It is the heavy machinery of a formal, high-productivity economy.
Wait, the exact type of economy that creates the formal jobs needed to pull people out of vulnerable street vending.
Precisely. So when we see CO2 emissions drop from 2.23 to 0.81 tons, it doesn't mean they suddenly installed millions of wind turbines
It means their traditional industrial development has completely stalled.
or collapsed entirely. When civil conflict breaks out or institutions crumble, the first things to be destroyed, abandoned, or shut down are the large factories.
Because heavy industry requires massive capital investment, reliable baseload power, and secure transport routes.
And capital is notoriously cowardly. It flees at the first sign of conflict.
So they aren't emitting less carbon because they are environmentally conscious. They are emitting less carbon because the heavy engines of economic mobility have simply been turned off.
We are witnessing forced, passive deindustrialization. They are living in an economy of survival rather than an economy of production.
And the electricity they are getting, that leap to 58.9% access, is largely just for basic residential consumption.
Exactly. Lighting a bulb, running a small fan, charging a phone. It is not powering vast industrial parks that would employ thousands of people in formal tax-paying jobs.
So, while it is beneficial for the global atmospheric carbon count that their emissions are low, the mechanism driving that reduction is economic stagnation. It is severe poverty masquerading as environmentalism on a spreadsheet.
That is a brilliant, sobering distinction. It completely underscores why we cannot just accept a top-line number at face value. We have to interrogate the causal mechanism beneath it.
And this tension, this recurring theme of incredible human resilience masking an underlying structural failure, brings us to the absolute centerpiece of the World Bank's data panorama.
Yes, the paradoxes of human capital. This is where the data becomes highly emotional and, frankly, deeply frustrating.
Let's start with the triumph on slide 10. The visual here is a steeply ascending line graph drawn in deep navy blue that completely smashes through a horizontal 90% milestone line.
This represents primary school gross enrollment, and it has surged from 57.7% to an absolutely incredible 94.2%.
We have to acknowledge what a staggering human achievement this is. To go from barely half of children in school to near universal primary enrollment in regions plagued by war, corruption, and systemic poverty.
It's astounding. This is the result of decades of relentless, grinding work by international organizations, bilateral aid agencies, and local educators who literally risk their lives to teach.
It's the result of building schools in remote villages, training teachers, and implementing school feeding programs.
Right. Those feeding programs give desperate parents an economic incentive to send their kids to school instead of sending them to work in the fields. It is a historic win.
It is, but the designers of this presentation do not let us celebrate for long. The very next data point on slide 11 introduces a visual format called a dumbbell plot.
For you listening, imagine two dots connected by a horizontal line, like a weightlifter's barbell. It's a great way to visually represent the gap between two related data points.
And this dumbbell plot shows a massive, cruel chasm. It maps adult literacy for ages 15 and older.
While primary school enrollment hit 94.2%, adult literacy only rose from 57.7% to 67.5%.
I really need to understand the mechanics of this failure. How can the gap be that wide? If 94% of the kids are sitting inside a school building, why aren't they learning how to read?
Because we are confusing the existence of a physical building with the existence of a functioning institution.
Oh, wow. Okay, expand on that.
Building a four-wall structure and putting a tin roof on it is relatively easy. That is a basic capital expenditure. International aid can write a check for a building.
But converting attendance into actual human capital, the ability to read, write, perform mathematics, and think critically, requires deep, continuous, stable institutional capacity.
Exactly. Let's look at what is actually happening inside that classroom. In an FCS region, the physical school building might exist, earning the country a check mark for the enrollment metric.
But the state might be so broke that the teacher hasn't been paid a salary in 6 months.
So the teacher simply doesn't show up. They are out working in the informal economy just to survive. Or the teacher does show up, but there are 90 children crammed into a single classroom sharing one outdated textbook.
Or there are deeper, invisible barriers to learning. You have children suffering from chronic, low-grade malnutrition.
Which actively stunts cognitive development and makes it incredibly difficult for them to retain information. You have children suffering from the psychological trauma of localized violence.
You have a lack of electricity at home, meaning no one can do homework after dark.
So millions of children are technically enrolled for 5 or 6 years, satisfying the international aid metrics, but they leave the system functionally illiterate.
Nearly a third of the adult population in these regions still cannot read the warning label on a bottle of agricultural pesticide.
They cannot read a ballot paper to vote properly. They cannot read a basic contract for a microloan.
You cannot build a modern, high-productivity economy, the kind that moves people out of the vulnerable street vending we discussed earlier, when 30% of your labor force lacks basic literacy. The human capital pipeline is fundamentally leaky.
Yet, despite that leaky pipeline in education, when we move to the health data on slide 12, the X-ray shows something that looks like pure magic.
Yeah, we have a multi-line chart breaking right through a solid 60-year benchmark line. Life expectancy in these fragile, chaotic situations has leaped from an abysmal 46.1 years to 61.2 years.
Women are now reaching an average of 65.6 years, and men 58.1. Adding 15 years of life expectancy to an entire population across multiple nations is a tectonic shift in human history.
And the data shows us exactly where a lot of those years were saved on slide 13. We are looking at a downward sloping area chart.
The designer has used that muted red accent color to circle two massive contrasting numbers regarding infant mortality.
The rate of deaths per 1,000 live births drops from a horrific 97.6 down to 45.9. They literally cut the rate of babies dying in half.
But this creates a massive analytical puzzle. How on earth do you achieve a historic leap in life expectancy and have infant mortality in countries where the macroeconomy is stagnant?
Where the majority of jobs are informal survivalism and where the state schools cannot even teach kids to read, it seems mechanically impossible.
It really does. If the internal state mechanisms are so broken that they can't pay teachers or collect taxes, how is the health system functioning at such a high level?
Because these health victories are not being driven by the domestic economy or the domestic state, they are the direct result of targeted, highly effective, vertical humanitarian interventions.
Let's define that term. What makes an intervention vertical?
Think of a vertical intervention as a massive international bypass surgery.
Oh, I like that analogy.
The international aid community looks at a fragile nation and realizes the national arteries, the government ministries, the tax system, the local supply chains are completely blocked by corruption or lack of capacity.
So instead of trying to fix the whole system, they build a separate temporary vertical pipeline directly from the international donor straight to the patient to deliver one specific outcome.
Right. You don't need a functioning national tax system or a perfectly uncorrupt judiciary to deliver a measles vaccine.
Exactly. You just need an international NGO with a dedicated budget, a cold chain cooler, a jeep, and a trained nurse.
You don't need a booming GDP to distribute anti-malarial bed nets or basic prenatal vitamins. These are highly scalable, relatively inexpensive technological interventions.
The international aid community has basically perfected the logistics of biological survival.
They really have. It proves conclusively that direct humanitarian interventions work. They save millions of lives, and we should obviously celebrate that.
But, and this is the crucial, somewhat terrifying pivot of our deep dive, these vertical interventions create a profound demographic tension.
Because the bypass surgery keeps the patient alive, but the underlying heart disease of the nation remains untreated.
You now have a massive population that is surviving infancy. They are living 15 years longer. They are migrating to the cities.
But they are stepping into an absolute economic and institutional void.
Which brings us to the final, sobering section of our data panorama, the institutional anchor holding everything back. Slide 14.
We are looking at a visual format known as a reader chart. It looks somewhat like a spider web. The data points are clustered tightly near the center, trapped inside a red dashed circle labeled the danger zone,
which represents scores below 2.5. We are looking specifically at the CPIA property rights and rule-based governance score.
This is out of a total possible 6 points. And over the decades, the score for FCS regions has flatlined, stubbornly stuck between 2.35 and 2.69.
Recently, it has even started slipping backwards. Let's define what we are looking at here. CPIA stands for the Country Policy and Institutional Assessment.
Think of it as a sovereign credit score, but instead of just looking at national debt, it measures the actual quality of a country's institutional framework.
A score below 2.5 in property rights and governance means the fundamental rule of law is essentially non-existent.
Let's ground this abstract score in reality for a second. What does a 2.35 governance score actually look like for a normal person trying to build a life?
It looks like pure unpredictability and risk. Let's go back to our hypothetical street vendor, the woman selling food in the informal economy.
Okay, I'm picturing her.
Suppose through sheer grit, she saves up enough cash to buy a small piece of land to build a permanent brick-and-mortar shop. She wants to transition from the informal shadow economy into the formal economy.
That's the dream, right?
Exactly. But in a country with a 2.35 governance score, the local land registry is likely opaque and corrupt. She pays for the land, but a local official simply alters the deed and gives the land to his cousin.
Wow. So what recourse does she have? She goes to the courts.
She tries. She goes to the local court to sue. But the judge hasn't been paid by the state in months, so he requires a processing fee, a bribe, that she cannot afford.
Or the court system is simply so backlogged and broken that it will take 7 years to hear her case.
So she loses her life savings. She loses everything. And what is the macroeconomic lesson she and everyone watching her learns?
The lesson is never invest in permanent capital. Never try to build something lasting.
Exactly. Keep your assets liquid, hidden, and informal.
Economists refer to this as dead capital, right? The idea that there is wealth in these countries, but because you can't prove you own your land, you can't use it as collateral to get a bank loan to grow a business.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now, scale that dynamic up to the global level. Imagine you are an executive at a multinational manufacturing company. You are looking to build a massive plant that would employ 5,000 people in stable, formal jobs. You look at that 2.35 rule of law score.
You realize your factory could be expropriated by a new political faction, your supply contracts won't be enforced by local courts, and your shipments will be subjected to constant extortion at checkpoints.
Do you build the factory?
Not a chance. You take your capital to a more stable, developing nation, even if the labor costs are slightly higher.
Without robust governance and enforceable property rights, foreign capital refuses to enter and domestic businesses refuse to scale up.
The formal economy cannot grow in a vacuum of trust. And without a formal economy, you cannot generate the tax revenue needed to build the schools, lay the water pipes for the urbanization boom, or create the jobs for the massive youth bulge.
That stagnant radar chart is the anchor chain that keeps the entire nation stuck in the mud, no matter how many vaccines international NGOs deliver.
So we have reached the grand conclusion and policy pivot of the World Bank's presentation. Slide 15. The designer has split this final visual right down the middle.
On the left side, point upward, are bright green arrows highlighting the incredible humanitarian wins.
Basic survival has been revolutionized. Kids are sitting in classrooms at a 94% rate. Life expectancy has shattered the 60-year barrier. Infant mortality is half of what it was. It is a genuine triumph of the human spirit.
But on the right side of the visual, pointing straight down, are heavy, dark gray arrows representing deep structural crises.
An economy that crawls and violently crashes. A workforce where over 66% are trapped in vulnerable, informal survivalism.
A literacy rate that lags tragically behind enrollment. And a governance score that is completely frozen in the danger zone.
The takeaway here, the message that this data is screaming at policymakers, economists, and all of us analyzing this deep dive, is that the global approach to these fragile regions must fundamentally evolve.
For the last several decades, the global strategy has been heavily weighted toward humanitarian rescue, keeping people alive. And we succeeded at that.
We proved we know how to bypass broken systems to distribute medicine and build primary schools. But biological survival is no longer enough.
The bypass surgery was successful, but the patient still has no future.
The era of purely focusing on humanitarian rescue must pivot. The priority must shift aggressively toward building institutions.
This is the hardest, slowest, least glamorous work of all. It means training judges, securing land registries, fighting systemic corruption, and creating the boring, foundational legal frameworks that allow formal sector jobs to exist.
Because if we don't build the institutions that create jobs, all of those beautiful humanitarian wins will begin to cannibalize themselves.
Which brings us to a final thought I want you to mull over as we wrap up this X-ray of global fragility.
Yes, thanks to those incredible green arrows on the left side of our conclusion, we now have millions upon millions of young people living in fragile and conflict-affected situations.
They are highly urbanized, living shoulder to shoulder in massive cities. They're connected to the broader world through basic electricity and mobile phones.
They survived infancy, and they're going to live much longer than their parents did. But they are waking up every single morning in cities where the formal economy and their own governments have absolute zero space for them.
No jobs, no enforceable property rights, no political voice.
So here is the provocative question you have to ask yourself the next time you read a news headline about a sudden conflict breaking out or a massive migration crisis at a border.
What happens politically and socially when a massive, healthy, urbanized generation realizes that the system is entirely rigged against their future?
Are we looking at the ingredients for an unprecedented, explosive demographic dividend if we can somehow fix these institutions? Or are we looking at the perfectly primed spark for the next massive wave of global conflict?
It is arguably the defining geopolitical question of the next 50 years.
It really is. Thank you for joining us in unpacking this incredible, complex data panorama. The numbers always tell a much deeper story if you know how to look at the mechanics beneath them.
Keep questioning the charts behind the news.
And we'll see you on the next deep dive.